The Child by Jules Valles book review. So right off the bat, first of all, an apology for mangling all the French. I've never learned how to speak French. The author's name is Jules, Jules, Valles, Valles. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. All the proper names in this I'm going to mispronounce. Sorry in advance. Right, so this is part of a trilogy, and I'm reading it out of order, just because that's the way I got my hands on these books. The first one was this is actually the first book in the trilogy. Okay, let me start over. Jules Valles, who was he? I know I'm mispronouncing his name. He was a French socialist during the 19th century, and he was involved in the Paris Commune. And I say involved in the Paris Commune, meaning not only was he on the barricades and, involved in the street fighting and all that, but he was elected to the Paris Commune government. The Paris Commune was a short-lived insurrection in Paris, which was crushed by the French army after 2 months and rather brutally put down. Jules Valles was a witness to kind of the bloody week, but he was able to escape, I think, by hiding himself in an ambulance or something. I don't remember offhand, actually. In exile, he published a trilogy of books, The Child, The Student, and The Insurrectionist, which were his kind of life story, sort of. Although he changed the name. He doesn't call himself Jules Valles in the book. He calls himself Jacques Vingtras, which is another French name I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. But the point is, it's one of those weird memoirs where it is kind of his memoirs, but he's changed the name to allow himself plausible deniability in case, I don't know. I don't know why he did that. But most of the reviews I've read of this have said essentially these are just his memoirs. Anyways, of the 3 books, the last book, The Insurrectionist, I think was last published in English in 1971 or something, and has not been in print in English since then. The middle book, as far as I can tell, was never translated into English. But The Child was reprinted and republished in 2005 by, I think, the New York Review Books publisher. So this one at least should be readily available. I'm not sure if it's still in print in 2019, but there should be enough kind of copies in circulation from the last time it got a major publishing. I was hoping at the time that they would kind of go through and republish all of the trilogy, but they only published The Child. And they said right in the publisher's introduction that the reason they've chosen to only publish The Child is because it's apolitical. So the other 2 books are kind of only interesting to political junkies. The Child is talking about his childhood. And as such, it's not talking about any socialist theory. He was never big on theory, Jules Valles, but it wasn't talking about any like insurrections or political stuff. It was just talking about his childhood. So they said right in the publisher's introduction, we're only interested in publishing this first book. And then sure enough, as far as I can tell, that's the only book they ever republished. If you want to read the middle book, I guess you're going to have to learn how to read French. And if you ever do read the middle book, let me know how it is. And then the last book, The Insurrectionist, you should be able to track down as a used book. I tracked it down over Amazon. But anyways, concerning ourselves today with only The Child, because that's the book we're reviewing today. The book begins, "I dedicate this book to all those who were bored stiff at school or reduced to tears at home, who in childhood were bullied by their teachers or thrashed by their parents." So that's the introduction that Jules Valles had written. You can tell right from the beginning that the story is the book is anti-authoritarian and anti-establishment. It is, as I said, largely apolitical, except for the last few chapters when Valles becomes, or the character, Jules Valles or his counterpart, Jacques Vintress, becomes interested in the history of the French Revolution. Because of the excessive misfortunes of Jules Valles or his Roman Eclef counterpart, and the humorous ways in which they are related in this book, a number of reviewers I've read compared him to Charles Dickens. And yeah, I can say that I can see where that tone is coming from. No doubt that if Jules Valles had lived today, no one would begrudge him years of therapy after this childhood. As it was, it is small wonder that this man grew up to become a lifelong rebel and outsider. And the tone of the book is set right from the beginning. So quoting now from the beginning of the book, "Was I breastfed by my mother? Did I get my milk from some pleasant wet nurse? I just don't know. But whatever breast I may have gnawed at, I don't remember. When I was tiny, ever being cuddled, made a fuss of, pampered, indulged, given little kisses. I was given lots of beatings. My mother says, spare the rod and spoil the child. And every morning she gives me a beating. And if she doesn't have time in the morning, she'll save it until the afternoon. Hardly ever later than 4 o'clock. Madame Ballandreau is a kindly old spinster of 50. She lives downstairs. In the beginning, she was quite pleased. Not having a clock, she used me to tell the time. Slap, bang, wham, whack, whack. It's that young un upstairs getting his walloping. Time to make my coffee. From this beginning, Valles continues through the rest of the book to detail every cruelty his parents ever inflicted on him. Now, since he was a child who was regularly beat by both of his parents, some of his complaints are no doubt valid. But as the book continues, some of the things he chronicles, the injustices from his parents, seems so little as to be almost petty. He complains about the ridiculous clothes his mother sent him off to school in, or how his paranoid mother, fearing for his safety, was always forbidding him to do anything the other children regularly enjoyed. Now remember, this is a man who is in his adult life, lived years on the streets, was imprisoned, was shot at, witnessed the massacres at the end of the Paris Commune, and here he is at the end of his life just obsessing with chronicling every little thing that was denied to him as a child. It made me think about how impressionable we are as children. Like, a small injustice to a child just seems like a huge deal. And even when you become an adult and you, in theory, have a more rational perspective on it, you remember that feeling of injustice and how strongly you felt it as a child, and that makes an impression on you. And it certainly seemed to have made an impression on Jules Valles. With such a subject, this book could have ended up being very depressing. But Jules Valles keeps his sense of humor as he writes it. So it's very humorous. I found myself mostly laughing as the character goes from one childhood misadventure to another. Now, the tone does darken sometimes. For example, when he's describing a childhood friend of his who was beaten to death by her father, and how this incident convinced him that the rest of his life he would always stick up for the defenseless. But these kind of darker moments aside, on the whole, this was one of the funniest books I've read in a long time. The mother in this book is a real character. I've read some reviewers describing her as a sadist, for all the ways she thinks up to torment her husband and her child. To me, she most reminded me of that mother from that TV show Malcolm in the Middle. She's a bit more extreme, but just the stubbornness she has, where when she gets into a battle of wills, she would just not back down. Quoting from a section of the book that illustrates this. This is talking about one of the family's journeys. They'd gone somewhere on holiday. And on the way back, "You're not hungry?" my father inquired on the way. "Why should I be hungry?" my mother retorted. "I have to tell you that in the course of the previous evening, my father has suggested eating at the buffet in Verzon. Verzon is a place name. In case we weren't able to find anywhere to eat later on. My mother had turned down the suggestion, and she had no intention of letting her decision be questioned by being asked if she was hungry now. My father didn't argue, because his hands were tied. When we left, he acted most unwisely. He handed over all our money to his wife. My mother had said in an innocent voice, 'I've got bigger pockets than you. They'll hold the money better. I can pay for everything on the journey.' Initially, my father didn't appreciate the full extent of his misfortunes or the seriousness of his error. But at the first change of horses, the blow struck home. He had no money at all, not a single franc, not even a couple of sous. He had given away all of his small change in tips to railway porters and such. Now he didn't even have enough to buy a glass of currant brandy." So that's an excerpt from the book, but the battle over the money continues over the whole rest of the chapter. The father and son are always trying to find some way to get food or drink. Mother is always refusing to give in. Aside from his parents, who are a big target of Jules Valles' resentment, the other big target of his resentment is the education system. Jules Valles details all the ridiculous antics that go on during his thoroughly classical education. Some of this is like straight out of Monty Python. Like at one point, he has to write for Latin class. They each have to write a poem in Latin about the death of a parrot to express grief. So quoting from the book, "We've been told to write about the death of a parrot. I'd said everything anyone could say when confronted by such a calamity, that I'd never find consolation, that when he saw the cage now transformed into a coffin, Sharon would drop his oars, that moreover I'd be burying him myself, and that we'd be scattering flowers. In one of my ingenious lines, I exclaimed, 'Now, alas, you can plant parsley on the tomb.' The teacher compliments me on this last subtle touch, but I've come second to Breslar, another classmate, who showed even deeper emotion and more sincere grief. He hit on the idea, borrowed from the hymn tunes, of introducing a repeated refrain. The parrot has died. It has already passed away, alas. And in the original book, this is intercut with the actual Latin that was used in these poems. Another one of my favorite parts of the book is commotion that the young narrator causes in his examination when he states that there are 8 instead of 7 properties of the soul, and just all the outrage that this leads to. All in all, a very funny and also moving book. Definitely worth reading if you can track it down.